What did ordinary people eat in ancient Rome? Not great patricians, not senators with their rich feasts and full tables, but those who woke up every morning to the noise of street vendors, went out into the dirty, dusty streets, and went to earn their bread literally with their own hands. The plebeians, the backbone of Roman society, lived in cramped and stuffy apartments, worked from dawn to dusk, faced food supply disruptions, lack of sanitation, disease outbreaks, and price instability. Their diet was far from luxurious. A little bread, boiled spelt, bean soup, dried figs, diluted wine or vinegar drink. Everything is simple, cheap, and extremely functional. But it is precisely this simplicity that hides the real ancient reality: harsh, rich, multi-layered. Food reflected not just the level of affluence, but the entire structure of the world. Social hierarchy, climate, supply chain, politics, customs, and even personal relationships. What a person ate, where he ate, and with whom he shared a meal said as much about him as his toga or origin. After all, in ancient Rome, as in any complex society, there was more hidden behind every everyday action than it seems. Here, slaves and freedmen, soldiers and old men, men and women, lovers and spouses ate together. By the way, relationships between people of the same sex, although not always formally recognized, were quite common, especially in cities where the personal and public often intertwined in the most unexpected forms. A home-cooked meal, a shared meal, or even a simple cup of wine could be not just a food item, but a form of connection, trust, and acceptance. So the question is, would you be able to survive in these conditions? Would you be able to adapt to the lack of refrigerators, microwaves, coffee in the morning, and access to clean water? Would you be able to live a day, a week, a month on what you can buy at a street stall for a copper coin? Or grow it yourself on a narrow strip of land outside the city walls? Stay until the end. You will learn what product literally held the empire together, how street food saved thousands of citizens, what meat was substituted for, what drink soldiers preferred, and why figs could tell more about the life of a plebeian than a marble bust. This is not just a story about food. It is a story about survival, adaptation, and humanity in conditions that would seem extreme to us today. Grains were not just a part of the Roman plebeian diet. They were his mainstay, his safe haven, his means of survival in an unpredictable and harsh world. Spelt spelta, barley, hordeum, wheat, triticum. These cereals determined not only what fell into the clay bowl every day, but also how the entire supply system of multi-million-strong Rome was built. Without grain, not only would breakfast have stopped, but the city would have stopped. Grain was stored for a long time, transported relatively easily, and could be prepared in different ways. Still, most of the time it came down to the simplest thing: a pulse. Thick porridge cooked in water, without oil, without salt, without spices. Dense, stringy, heavy. It nourished and tired at the same time. But it was she who saved you from starvation and allowed you to live until the next day. Sometimes grated garlic, cabbage, and legumes were added to it, depending on the time of year and the availability of products on the market. But more often than not, it's just a pulse. In the morning, in the daytime, and in the evening. The same grains were used to bake bread, a product that was both everyday and sacred. The bread was dark, dense, with an admixture of husk and ash, sometimes with a touch of sand due to poor grinding. Still, it was welcome. Warm, steaming bread fresh from the oven could turn a wild dinner into a kind of celebration. It was bought in the markets or baked at home if there was firewood and a clay oven. For those who lived in urban insulae, small apartments with minimal conditions, often the only source of bread was public bakeries, which were supplied with state grain through a nona. A nona is more than a supply chain. It was the ancient equivalent of a ration card, a guaranteed minimum in case of a crisis, crop failure, or unemployment. Already under the Emperor Augustus, it became a cornerstone of imperial policy. Barren or cheap grain ensured the loyalty of the plebs, reduced the risk of hunger riots, and preserved the image of the emperor as the patron saint of the people. Without this bread, the city might have exploded with despair. With him, he lived. Sometimes grain even became part of informal unions. Neighbors cooked porridge for two, shared a loaf of bread, and sometimes even a roof. In cramped quarters, where walls were thin and personal space was almost non-existent, a single bowl breakfast was much more intimate than just a shared meal. Historians still debate where the line between friendship, everyday life, and personal feelings lay in Roman society. In some cases, neighbors, servants, co-workers, or tenants may have lived for years in a tight emotional and domestic bond, sharing not only a table, but also a bed. Although official same-sex marriages in Rome did not exist in a modern legal form, there is documentary evidence of same-sex ceremonies and strong unions often tied to the joint conduct of everyday life, including food. Grains, then, were not just a source of calories. They were an instrument of politics, an object of trade, a basis for survival, and even a part of one's personal life. Porridge, bread, grain sacks, and bakeries were full of real life, with its complexities, attachments, compromises, and laws. And in this modest food, the main truth was revealed. Ancient man ate not to enjoy himself, but to survive. And perhaps in this survival, it was not only the grain that helped him, but also the warmth of the person sitting next to him at the table. If ancient Rome had had a national symbol of modesty and survival, it wouldn't have been a statue, a coin, or even a gladiator's sword. It would have been a humble pulse bowl. This thick porridge made from spelt or barley, cooked in water without salt and oil, has become an almost universal answer to all questions related to nutrition among the poorest segments of the population. The pulse was morning breakfast and late dinner, food on the hike and at home. It was shared, it was finished, it fell asleep with it. It was ubiquitous. Cooking pulse didn't require any culinary skills or complicated utensils. Boil water, add grains, cook until thick, and you're done. In this form, it was eaten everywhere. In villas outside the city, in legionnaires, barracks, in craft shops, and in the dark, crowded rooms of the city's insula. When the plebeians managed to get a little garlic, herbs, or vinegar, the dish became richer. On particularly good days, with a handful of beans or a drop of butter, the pulse turned almost into a holiday. But more often than not, it was what it had always been, a meal devoid of frills, but one that gave you the strength to move on. The nutritional value of the pulse was its density, the ability to digest and saturate the body for a long time. This was especially important in conditions of heavy physical labor, on a construction site, in the port, in the field. This mess literally kept millions on their feet. Without it, it is impossible to imagine the everyday life of a simple Roman. The pulse was not only food, but also part of the social philosophy. In ancient literature, it was often contrasted with the rich dishes of the nobility as a symbol of honesty, moderation, and virtue. Cicero called the pulse the food of a decent person, emphasizing that modesty in food means both modesty in desires and purity of intentions. For the Stoics and the simple-minded, the pulse was not just a mess, it was a manifesto against excess. Interestingly, in the context of everyday life, the pulse often appeared in situations of intimacy and everyday partnership. It was shared by neighbors, colleagues, and tenants of the same room. In such spaces, where everyday boundaries were blurred and eating together was a daily necessity, connections were born that modern people could call very close. Some sources describe pairs of men who lived in the same house, kept a common household, and even shared a meal from the same bowl. It didn't always mean romantic relationships in our sense, but historians are increasingly paying attention to the stability and intimacy of such relationships, especially in urban neighborhoods where survival depended on mutual support. In this sense, the pulse is not just the food of the poor, but a kind of ritual of survival and rapprochement. Behind its simplicity was what the Romans had in common: physical labor, lack of choice, and, oddly enough, human closeness. Albeit without names, but with a common bread and a common cauldron. The pulse was bigger than the food. It was a connecting element between people, a symbol of constancy and proof that even the most modest food can become the foundation of an entire civilization. In the daily life of the Roman plebeian, vegetables were not a side dish. They were the mainstay. In a world where meat was less common than a sunny day in December, It was the modest gifts of the earth cabbage, turnips, garlic, onions, legumes that became the food for every day. They did not shine with the aroma of spices, were not served on silver trays, but they saved from hunger, gave energy, and brought a sense of fullness. There was no luxury in them, only necessity and utility. In Roman cities, especially in densely populated neighborhoods, many families had access to small courtyards or roofs where herbs, and even small potted vegetable crops were grown. Outside of the city on private plots, such beds turned into a real food storage. Vegetables could be grown with your own hands, and this gave you a sense of control in a world where everything else depended on power, the market, and fate. In summer, fresh zucchini, beans, cucumbers, greens. In winter, salted cabbage, dried onions, beans. Many products were hung from ceilings or stored in basements. The Romans valued practicality. Everything that could be saved was used. Onions and garlic were used not only in cooking, but also as a remedy for diseases ranging from colds to eating disorders. Given the limited medical care available to the poorest, food itself became medicine. Legumes played a special role. Beans, lentils, peas, and chickpeas were all available and rich in protein. They were cooked in thick stews, added to the puls, or eaten separately. Even without meat, these dishes could be satisfying. Although these stews seem modest, they were surprisingly resilient in their nutritional content. Without them, the urban plebs would not have survived. But there was another quiet social reality behind the products. Vegetables were often grown and prepared together. Neighbors on the same floor or house could exchange crops, share supplies, make soup for everyone. These joint dinners, informal, spontaneous, and homemade, became not only an act of survival, but also strengthened ties, especially in Insula, where people live side by side, sharing firewood, water, rumors, and silence. This closeness created not only friendships, but sometimes even deeper relationships, even if not documented marriages, but emotional and domestic partnerships that were as stable as traditional families. Even archaeologists admit that the daily life of ordinary Romans is much more complicated than is commonly thought. Not all relationships were clearly defined. Not all food was just food. Sometimes a bowl of vegetable stew eaten together at a smoky table meant more than an entire banquet at the senator's house. Vegetables were not the decoration of a poor man's table. They were the essence of it. Their simplicity, accessibility, and vital necessity made them the core of survival and mutual aid. It was in this seeming scarcity that an amazing resilience was born. The ability to live, grow, and find support in food, in the ground, and sometimes in each other. In the plebeian diet, fruit was not an everyday necessity. It was a signal of change, a taste of a certain time of year, a short holiday in a series of restrained everyday life. If grains were fed, vegetables were saturated, and legumes were supported, then fruits were happy. They were not bought in bags, not stored in reserve, not waited for every day. They came when their time was right, and with that time they left. In the markets and street stalls, you could find apples, pears, figs, quinces, plums, grapes, sometimes even dates, but not all at once and not all. The season dictated the range, the weather dictated the price, and luck dictated the quality. Figs were perhaps the most popular fruit. They grew quickly, bore fruit generously, dried well, and could be stored longer than others. Its sweetness made up for the lack of sugar in everyday cooking. One dried fig in the worker's pocket, it was a snack, a dessert, and a piece of childhood. Fruits were eaten not only fresh, they were dried in the sun, boiled, ground into a paste, put in porridges, chowders, dough. Sometimes they even made the simplest jam or marmalade, especially in rural areas. Dried pears, apples, grapes. All this added a touch of sweetness to the usual dishes and kept the warmth of summer in the cold months. Grape wine has a special history. Even for a plebeian, grapes were not a luxury. They were crushed, fermented, and infused to produce a vital, if sour, drink. The same wine that was later diluted and drunk not only for pleasure, but also for safety, as a substitute for dubious city water. Fruits were associated not only with nutrition, but also with a sense of time. When figs appeared, it meant that summer had come into force. When the market smelled of apples, it was autumn. The fruits told people that it was time to change clothes, preparations, and habits. There was no stability in them, but there was a cycle, a rhythm that even food obeyed. And often these gifts of nature were shared. One fix in half, a handful of grapes for three, not because it was too much, but because it was the right thing to do. People who lived in the same house, shared a meal and a roof, shared fruit as they shared bread or bean soup. Sometimes they were families, sometimes they were friends. Sometimes they were those whose relationships were formed on the basis of an everyday partnership, not always formally described, but quite strong. And when one brought an apple and the other a dried pear, it was not just a meal but a sign of trust. Fruit in ancient Rome was far from a luxury. These were the fruits of their time, the gifts of the land that came and went. But in these short days of their presence, they reflected a whole life, with its labors, its hopes, its seasonal joys. They didn't make the plebeians diet rich, but they made him live. And these ams are irreplaceable. In the daily life of the Roman plebeian, meat was more of an event than a habit. For most people in Rome, especially in the lower strata, meat was not part of the daily diet. It was associated with festivals, rituals, sacrifices, and the extremely rare occasions when luck or the favor of the gods, or patron, brought something other than porridge and vegetables to the table. Meat was expensive and spoiled quickly, especially in hot climates. It was impossible to store it for long without salt or smoking, and of course there were no refrigerators. Therefore, most of the population either could not afford meat at all or received it in leftovers, tendons, bones, entrails, scraps. These parts of the animal could be sold at street markets or obtained from the bounty of wealthier householders when, for example, slaves were given the remains of feasts. For the urban plebeian, the most realistic way to obtain meat was through public sacrifices. After a portion of the carcass was offered to the gods, the rest was distributed among priests, officials, and sometimes ordinary citizens. Such days turned into local holidays. Pieces of meat were fried on the streets, food was shared, and neighbors gathered. But such events were rare. Sometimes meat appeared in thermopolis in fried or stewed form. But even there, it wasn't the centerpiece, but rather an ingredient in a stew or side dish. Those who could afford to buy a little meat, most often it was chicken, goat meat, corned beef, used it sparingly, often stretching it for several days. Another source of meat could be domestic animals, chickens, goats, even small cattle. However, killing an animal meant losing a permanent source of eggs, milk, or wool. Therefore, it was rarely resorted to and in extreme need. It was a little easier in rural areas. Plebeians living outside the city could exchange food, participate in seasonal slaughter, or hunt game. But even there, meat remained an unusual, valuable, and strictly dosed element of the diet. Attitudes to meat reflected social distance. Roasts were served daily in the homes of the nobility. Among the plebeians, meat often became an occasion for a meeting, a joint dinner, a small holiday. Sometimes 2 or 3 neighbors would throw in a chicken or goat leg, cook together, eat for a long time, sharing not only food but also conversations, memories, and views. At such moments, family cohesion turned into something more, especially among people who lived together for years, without formal marriages, but with a common life, a common cuisine, and a common history. Again, as with pulse and vegetables, food became the foundation of bonds, sometimes stronger than legal ties. Meat in the plebeian diet was rare, but important. It was not only satiating, it symbolized a holiday, good luck, or someone's care. The taste of meat was memorable, and perhaps that's why it was accompanied by stories, smells of smoke, collective cooking, and evening conversations against the wall, where something especially delicious was being fried. Rare but expensive. Literally and humanly, the city of Rome never slept. The stone pavements rattled under the wheels of carts, the hum of voices filled the narrow streets, and at the heart of the bustle were the thermopolis, the street establishments where Roman plebeians satisfied their hunger, hurry, and loneliness. Thermopolis were located on the first floors of houses, with windows and counters facing directly onto the street. Hot food was stored in containers built into the counter, dolia. Passers-by could stop, order a portion, eat on the spot, or take it with them. It was a cross between a canteen, a market, and a social playground. A place where the meal became not a private, but a public affair. For the residents of Insel, multi-story buildings without kitchens and with shared facilities, Thermopylae was vital. Not everyone had firewood or a place for a hearth. Not everyone had the energy to make pottage after work. Here, at the stone counter with hot earthenware, the main problem was solved: how to eat quickly, cheaply, and effortlessly. The menu was simple but satisfying. Thick vegetable stews, warm pulse, stewed beans, bread, olives, boiled eggs, and pieces of salted fish. If you're lucky, some grilled meat. They drank the vinegar drink, posa, or weak wine, most often diluted with water. It wasn't a gourmet treat, but a survival ritual with the taste of street dust, the spice of conversation, and the smoke from the nearby shop. But Thermopylaes weren't just food. They were platforms for communication and spontaneous rapprochement. Here, neighbors met, discussed prices, shared news, quarreled, and made up. There might be a craftsman, a soldier, a widow, or a freedman at the same table. People of different destinies, but with the same desire to get enough, to hear the voice of another, not to be alone. Some people spent part of the day in the Thermopylae, eating, waiting, watching. Acquaintances, domestic unions, and sometimes long-term relationships that went beyond food and business were formed between visitors. Shared meals brought us closer together. In these street shops, not only friends but also couples met. Not always traditional. In the vibrant, multilingual capital, borders were more flexible than people might think. Graffiti left on the walls of Thermopylae sometimes contains confessions, phrases of a personal nature, hints of close relationships, including between men. What wasn't chronicled was left on the plaster. Archaeological finds in Pompeii made it possible to see the Thermopylae as if on pause. Painted walls, menus, vessels with food remnants were preserved. This isn't an abstract story. It's a frozen moment in life where you can almost hear someone asking for a thicker pottage and someone offering to share the bread. Thermopylaes have become a symbol of the poor's adaptation to the demands of urban life. A place where scarcity and resourcefulness, everyday food and lively communication were combined. Here in the shadow of the walls, among the hot bowls and rough countertops, the plebeians found the main thing. Not refinement, but prosperity. Not loneliness, but belonging. That is why Thermopylae is not just a street kitchen, but a real social institution. In simplicity, in a clay bowl, the pulse of the city. In ancient Rome, olive oil was much more than just a condiment. It was a product that combined taste, energy, status, and even light literally. It was used to fill lamps, treat skin, heal wounds, offer sacrifices to the gods, and, of course, add to food. But for the plebeian, especially in the city, this oil was precious, dosed drop by drop. The main supply of oil came from the south of Italy and from the western provinces, especially from Baetica, now Andalusia, where dense rows of olive trees stretched to the horizon. The oil was stored in amphorae, transported by ship and distributed through merchants or local markets. In rich homes, it was not spared. They watered vegetables, marinated meat, rubbed the skin of slaves, and covered marble countertops. In the houses of the plebeians, however, they saved oil. In poor families, it was used pointwise. A few drops in the pulse to soften the porridge. A little, on onions and garlic when roasting, if there was a frying pan at all and the ability to cook. Sometimes the bread was dipped directly into the butter, saving on everything else. Butter not only made food tastier, it also increased its energy value, which is especially important in winter, when the diet was reduced to grains, beans, and pickles. Sometimes the oil had to be diluted with water or vinegar to stretch. Sometimes buy by weight together with a neighbor, sharing not only the amphora, but also expenses. In such cases, food brought people together. Buying butter together turned into cooking together, and then into eating together. And these were not just culinary gestures, but forms of trust, intimacy, and economic union. Especially often, such partnerships arose between single men, neighbors in the house or shop, for whom a common table was not just a necessity, but also a support in everyday life. Oil, oddly enough, has become a measure of well-being. Its presence on the table said it wasn't luxury, But it wasn't desperation either. Here you can afford a drop of taste, a drop of warmth, a drop of light. Butter wasn't just a product, it was a cultural code, a reflection of belonging to a world where people could still choose how to cook, not just what to eat. Olive oil also kept its connection with tradition. It was used in cleansing rites, rubbing babies, and funeral rituals. It took in everything: the smell of food, the shine of leather, the light of fire. Its absence was immediately felt, especially in the colder months, when the food became coarse, bland, and dry. Then even a spoonful of warm butter could remind you of summer, of fertility, of hands picking fruit from a tree somewhere far away on the other side of the empire. For the Roman plebeian, olive oil was the boundary between poverty and misery, between survival and comfort, between empty bread and bread with a soul. It was a reminder that food is not only a necessity, but also a culture. And even in the humblest of kitchens with a crack in the wall and soot on the hearth, there was still room for a drop of flavor. In ancient Rome, where meat was a rarity and nutrition was a matter of survival, legumes became a real mainstay of the poor's diet. Beans, lentils, peas, chickpeas. These simple, unpretentious plants not only replaced meat, but also largely saved from exhaustion those who daily invested their energy in working in the fields, in workshops, in construction, and in everyday life. Legumes were valued primarily for their high nutritional value and storage stability. Dried grains could be kept in clay amphorae or bags for months. They did not spoil, did not require special conditions, and at the same time remained nutritious, rich in protein and fiber. They were simply cooked, seasoned with garlic, vinegar, herbs, or olive oil, if any. Sometimes they were ground into a paste or served with black bread. Even in the most modest conditions, legumes gave a sense of satiety and prosperity. Lentils were the most popular archivitsa. It was sold in markets, stored for the winter, and cooked more often than any other crop. Quick to prepare, it was perfectly absorbed, and in a soup with onions and garlic, it became almost a symbol of Roman everyday life. Peas and chickpeas were less common, but they were also part of the culinary tradition, especially in the provinces and rural areas, where the climate allowed them to grow. Legumes were often the mainstay of shared meals, especially in cities where plebeians lived in cramped insula. They were easy to cook for everyone. Put on the pot, add a handful of beans, chop the onion, and dinner for 3, 5, or even a whole floor is ready. Such dinners were united. Sometimes at the table were neighbors, colleagues in the craft, and sometimes people who were united not only by everyday life, but also by closer relationships. Living together, cooking together, sharing not only expenses but also food. It was a part of everyday life that did not require explanations or labels. Food, like shelter, was often shared. While such alliances rarely made it into official records, they were in fact part of the very Roman life in which survival was built on intimacy, trust, and sharing the bare necessities of life. Even a simple pot of lentils in this context was transformed from a meal to a form of support, both emotionally and physically. In addition, legumes played a role in cultural representations. They are mentioned in Roman cookbooks, philosophical treatises, and even anecdotes. They were credited with healing properties, the ability to strengthen the body and purify the spirit. In the Roman army, lentils and beans were part of rations because they were filling, simple, and versatile. Legumes have become a universal response to the challenges of poverty, meat scarcity, and hard physical work. They were a sustainable element of the kitchen that you could rely on at any time of the year. And it is precisely because of their simplicity, accessibility, and ability to bring people together at one bowl that they have taken a strong place in the cultural and everyday landscape of Rome. This would not be the food of the elite, but of those who held on to the empire and ate to survive. In ancient Rome, bread was more than food. It has become a symbol of order, a guarantee of survival, and even an instrument of political balance. For the plebeian, bread meant not only satiety, but also confidence in the future, as much as it was possible in the conditions of an ancient metropolis. It was simple, heavy, and sometimes rough to the taste, but it was what kept the city calm and the people subdued. Bread was made from flour, made from wheat, spelt, or barley, depending on how much money you had and where you lived. The rich could afford white, airy bread. Poor, coarse, with bran, grayish, dense, like a heavy cake. Such bread required effort to chew, but it was satisfying, long-stored and easily satiated even with a meager diet. Sometimes pieces of ash, husk or sand accidentally got into the flour. This was the price of quick and cheap processing. But even this did not stop those for whom bread was the basis of the diet. In homes with a stove, bread could be baked by themselves, especially in rural areas. But in cities, it was more often bought in bakeries, of which there were many almost on every block. Bakeries served entire streets, providing a steady supply of basic necessities. The smell of fresh bread in the morning was part of the urban landscape, ringing with the certainty that the day had begun and that it would be lived. With the introduction of the annona system, the state distribution of grain, bread became not only food, but also a social management tool. Under Augustus and his successors, the poorest strata began to be given grain according to lists, first at reduced prices, then free of charge. This grain could be ground and baked at home, or sold, and the proceeds could be used to buy ready-made bread. In the capital, which depends on food supplies from the provinces, this measure has been a lifesaver for hundreds of thousands of citizens. The bread was versatile and flexible. It was eaten with stews, dipped in vinegar or oil, put on top of vegetables or leftover fish. It became the main course when there was nothing else, and the accompaniment when something else appeared on the table. Even one slice of bread could be divided in half, in three, in pieces. And this was not only a gesture of necessity, but also a gesture of trust, good neighborliness, and sometimes closeness. Eating together always brings us together, and Roman bread was made not only from flour, but also from the habit of living together, helping, sharing. Bread brought together neighbors, families, even casual companions. Sometimes two young people who shared a house and household bought bread for two, had breakfast together, and in the evening returned home to a common meal. Their union might not be formally recognized, but within the insulae street, a blocket was quite understandable and accepted. And if they were only getting one serving of grain on Annona's list tomorrow, then they were cooking it together. How they lived. Bread has become a real social marker. It showed you where you were, whether you had access to government support, and whether you were able, even for one day, to feel protected. The authorities understood perfectly well. As long as there is bread, there is also order. That's why circuses came with bread, to satiate the body and distract the mind. For the Roman plebeian, bread was something that did not fail. It did not promise pleasure, did not give refinement, but it was, always. It was in the hands, in the memory, in the morning, and in the evening. It was something that could be passed on to another, and be sure that it would be understood as caring. This was its true value. In ancient Rome, drinks were not just a matter of taste, but a condition of survival, especially for plebeians who lived in conditions of constant shortage, heat, dust, and sanitary risks. What and how a Roman drank depended on where he lived, how much he earned, and what part of the city he had access to. And while food nourished the body, water and wine sustained it in an environment where even a sip of pure liquid could be a luxury. The main source of drinking, of course, was water. The Romans were proud of their system of aqueducts, fountains, and public wash basins. But the plebeians, especially those who lived in crowded insulae on the outskirts, often did not have direct access to these benefits. They used storage tanks or street taps where water stagnated, became polluted, or was diluted by rain. Not surprisingly, drinking water as it is was dangerous, especially in the heat when diseases spread rapidly. Therefore, diluted wine came to the fore not as a luxury, but as a form of hygiene. Wine in its pure form was drunk only by barbarians and drunkards. The Roman diluted it with water in the proportion of 1:1, 2:1, 3, and sometimes more. Such a drink was weak, light, but allowed to avoid infection, softened the taste of impure vodka, quenched thirst, and even improved digestion. It was drunk during meals, after work, in the morning, and in the evening, not for intoxication, but for balance. For the very poor and soldiers, there was posa, a weak vinegar solution that was made from spoiled wine or diluted with vinegar and water. Its tart, sour taste wasn't pleasant, but it was cooling, disinfecting, and invigorating. Sometimes honey or herbs were added to the paste, making the drink a little softer. It was an ancient isotonic concoction that could replace medicine and help in the heat. Sometimes, especially on holidays, the Romans drank muls, a wine laced with honey, herbs, or spices. Such a drink symbolized abundance, and its taste was rare for the plebeian table. It appeared at weddings, funerals, and religious celebrations on days when even the simplest food took on ritual significance. But the daily ritual of drinking was not without meaning. A shared cup of wine could be a form of greeting, gratitude, reconciliation. People drank together, in markets, at counters, in the shadows of shops, on the steps of public buildings, sometimes in small rooms where two people gathered at a common vessel. For single men who shared a place, wine could be a way to share an evening, talk, just hang around. In these minutiae, sip by sip, the invisible fabric of everyday Roman intimacy was formed. Drinking in ancient Rome was more than quenching your thirst. This is an adaptation to the environment, a way to fight diseases, a reflection of status and part of the communication culture. Through the bowl ran an invisible line between health and danger, poverty and moderation, loneliness and living together. And so, even a simple pozza or diluted wine was not only a drink, but also a part of the ancient art of living. Plebeian food in ancient Rome was simple, but in this simplicity was hidden a whole universe. From the rituals of everyday life to the limits of endurance of the human body. Spelt porridge, coarse bread, cabbage soup, a handful of beans, vinegar drink in a clay bowl. All this is not just a menu, but a reflection of the conditions in which millions lived. Food became a means of survival, an act of resilience, and sometimes the last link to keep a person from despair. The plebeian diet is a story of compromise, between the desire to get enough and the inability to get meat, between the dream of warm bread and the reality of the queue at Annona, between the hope of a neighbor's help and the duty to share the last piece. Each bowl of puls, each slice of bread, was not only a calorie, but also an element of a complex system of interdependencies. Between the state and the citizen, between the street and the market, between people living side by side. Sometimes it's too close so that it doesn't affect the fates. In this food, you can feel the rhythm, seasonality, labor, fear of hunger. But there is also something more: stability. Despite the poverty, despite the restrictions, this way of eating has proved to be strong and transferable. He developed a culture of survival, respect for simple work, the ability to be content with little and find value not in abundance, but in shared food. Through food, we look into everyday life, and through everyday life, in the soul. The way bread was shared, lentils were cooked together, or wine was drunk on the steps of the Thermopylae created relationships, friendships, neighborhoods, and partnerships that sometimes went beyond what is usually described in historical treatises. But they were, and the food, modest and warm, became what held them together. The story of food is the story of a person, and what the plebeian put in his bowl says more about him than any stone tombstone. His diet is a social document, left not on parchment, but in clay, ashes, in the surviving bakeries and ruins of Thermopolia. If you were interested, please like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, write down what part of everyday life in ancient Rome you would like to analyze further. How did you sleep? How did you love? How did you fight? How did you keep secrets? After all, even in the simplest details, the history of an entire era is hidden.